The widow's second chance, being happy again. 3 words that stopped Steve Harvey mid-sentence and transformed a game show studio into something sacred. 3 words that came from the mouth of a 61-year-old woman who had spent 40 years building a life with one man, only to spend the last 3 years learning how to live without him. 3 words that would remind millions of viewers that love doesn't end with death. Sometimes it finds new ways to begin. But this story doesn't begin with those 3 words. It begins in a cemetery in suburban Chicago on a Tuesday morning in October, where Dorothy Chen stood beside a marble headstone that read, William Chen, beloved husband and father, 1958-2020. Clutching a folded piece of paper in her trembling hands, Dorothy had been married to William for 40 years. They had met in college, 2 shy engineering students who bonded over late-night study sessions and a shared love of terrible science fiction movies. Their relationship had been built on friendship first, then deep affection, then the kind of steady, enduring love that becomes the foundation for an entire life. They had raised 3 children together. Jennifer, now 38 and a mother of 2, Michael, 35 and recently married, and David, 31 and still searching for his own path. They had bought their first house together, survived job losses and financial stress, celebrated promotions and graduations and grandchildren's first steps. They had grown old together gradually, gracefully, with the kind of partnership that makes other couples envious and gives hope to newlyweds. William's death had been sudden, a massive heart attack at 62. No warning, no time for goodbyes. One morning Dorothy had kissed him goodbye as he left for work, and by evening she was a widow, standing in a hospital room, trying to understand how a life could change so completely in the space of a single day. The first year after William's death had been about survival. Dorothy had moved through the logistics of grief, funeral arrangements, insurance paperwork, learning to manage finances that William had always handled. She had accepted casseroles from neighbors, attended grief counseling sessions that felt helpful and useless in equal measure, and slowly adjusted to the silence of a house that had once been filled with William's presence. The second year had been about adjustment. Dorothy had sold their large family home and moved to a smaller apartment. She had learned to cook for one, to make decisions without consulting anyone, to fill the long evenings and quiet weekends. She had returned to work part-time as a substitute teacher, finding comfort in the routine and purpose of helping children learn. But the third year had brought an unexpected complication. Robert Nakamura was 64, a recently retired widower who had lost his wife to cancer 2 years earlier. Dorothy had met him at a grief support group, where they had initially bonded over the shared experience of losing spouses and learning to navigate widowhood. Their friendship had developed slowly, built on long walks around the neighborhood, shared meals at quiet restaurants, and conversations about their late spouses that were equal parts celebration and mourning. Robert understood Dorothy's grief in ways that her well-meaning children couldn't. He knew what it felt like to wake up and instinctively reach for someone who would never be there. He understood the guilt of having moments of happiness, the feeling that enjoying life was somehow disloyal to the person they had lost. He knew how to talk about William with respect and love, never trying to compete with a memory but honoring it as part of who Dorothy was. Slowly, carefully, something had begun to develop between them. Not the passionate romance of their youth, but something deeper and more complex. Companionship seasoned with affection, friendship deepened by understanding, and eventually, tentatively, love that acknowledged the past while reaching toward the future. But Dorothy was struggling with guilt that felt overwhelming and impossible to resolve. Every moment of happiness she felt with Robert was shadowed by the voice in her head that whispered she was betraying William's memory. Every laugh they shared felt like a betrayal of her grief. Every touch, every kiss, every moment of contentment was complicated by the feeling that she was somehow being unfaithful to a marriage that death had ended, but her heart had not. Her children were supportive but confused. Jennifer wanted her mother to be happy but worried about Dorothy moving too quickly. Michael liked Robert but felt protective of his father's memory. David was encouraging but admitted he didn't know how to navigate having his mother date someone who wasn't his father. The paper Dorothy clutched at William's graveside that October morning was a letter she had written to her deceased husband. In it she had poured out her confusion, her guilt, her love for him, and her growing feelings for Robert. She had asked William for permission to be happy, for forgiveness for moving forward, for some sign that loving someone new didn't diminish the love they had shared. Standing there in the cemetery, surrounded by fallen leaves and the quiet of the October morning, Dorothy had felt no divine intervention, no cosmic sign, no message from beyond. She had felt only the weight of her own heart and the understanding that some decisions couldn't be made for her by anyone, living or dead. The Family Feud audition had been Robert's idea. Dorothy's children had been selected for the show as the Chen family team, and when Jennifer had mentioned that they needed one more family member, Robert had quietly suggested that Dorothy might enjoy the experience. "You don't have to think of it as moving on," Robert had told her gently. "Think of it as moving forward. William would want you to have joy in your life." Dorothy had initially resisted the idea. Being on television, pretending to be happy and carefree when she felt so conflicted, seemed impossible. But her children had been enthusiastic about including her, and Robert had offered to attend the taping as moral support, not as part of the family team but as someone who cared about her well-being. The night before the taping, Dorothy had called Robert, her voice shaking with uncertainty. "I feel like I'm lying," she had told him. "Like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not. How can I go on television and play games when I feel so torn up inside?" Robert had been quiet for a moment before responding. "Dorothy, you're not lying about who you are. You're someone who loved deeply and lost deeply and is trying to figure out how to love again. That's not something to hide from. That's something to be proud of." The Chen family had gathered at the studio that afternoon, with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Jennifer, Michael, and David were enthusiastic about the show but protective of their mother, aware that this was a big step for her in terms of being public and social after 3 years of grief. When Steve Harvey had called them onto the stage for the family introduction, Dorothy had felt overwhelmed by the lights, the audience, the energy of the game show environment. It was so different from the quiet, contemplative life she had built around her grief and her gradual healing. "And here we have the Chen family from Chicago," Steve had announced with his signature enthusiasm. "Tell me about your family, Dorothy." Dorothy had stepped forward, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite her internal turmoil. "We're here because my children believe their old mother needs to learn how to have fun again. I lost my husband 3 years ago, and they think it's time for me to start living instead of just surviving." Steve had looked at Dorothy with the kind of attention he reserved for contestants whose stories went deeper than typical game show fare. 3 years is a long time to be grieving. How are you doing?" Dorothy had glanced at her children, all of them encouraging her with their eyes, then looked back at Steve. "I'm learning that grief isn't something you get over. It's something you carry with you while you figure out how to build a new life around it." The game had progressed with the Chen family playing against the Rodriguez family from Phoenix. Dorothy had participated, contributing answers when called upon, but her heart wasn't fully engaged with the competition. She was thinking about Robert sitting in the audience, about William's memory, about the guilt that followed her everywhere she went. But it was during the 4th round that everything changed. The category was "Name something that makes you feel guilty." The Rodriguez family had just played their turn with answers like eating dessert, calling in sick, and spending money. Standard guilt responses that had earned them decent points, but nothing that touched on the deeper, more complex kinds of guilt that shaped people's lives. It was Dorothy's turn at the podium. Throughout the game, she had been competent but reserved, answering questions correctly but without the enthusiasm that made for great television. But now, facing this particular question, something shifted in her expression. She wasn't just a contestant anymore. She was a woman confronting the central conflict of her current life, the guilt that had been eating at her for months, the question that kept her awake at night, and shadowed every moment of potential happiness. Dorothy, Steve said, name something that makes you feel guilty. Dorothy stood at the podium, her hands gripping the edge as she considered the question. She thought about all the safe answers she could give, the responses that would earn points and keep her personal struggles private. But as she stood there, under the bright lights, surrounded by her children and aware that Robert was somewhere in the audience watching, she realized that this moment was bigger than a game show. When Dorothy finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, carrying across the studio with the weight of 3 years of internal struggle. Being happy again. The words landed in the studio like a confession. Steve's expression changed immediately. The entertainer's mask slipped away, revealing something deeper, more human. He understood instantly that this wasn't just a game show answer. This was the admission of a woman wrestling with one of the most complex emotional challenges anyone could face. Dorothy, Steve said gently, taking a step closer to her podium. That's not just an answer. That's courage. The board revealed that it wasn't there. The survey hadn't captured something so specific, so personal, so FOMO'd. But something had shifted in the studio. The audience wasn't thinking about points anymore. The Rodriguez family wasn't focused on winning. Everyone was looking at Dorothy, who was standing very still at the podium, processing the weight of having spoken her deepest fear aloud. Tell me about that, Steve said. And it wasn't a request from a host to a contestant. It was an invitation from one human being to another, who clearly had something important to say. Dorothy took a breath and looked out at the studio audience, then at her children, then back at Steve. I was married to my husband for 40 years. William was everything. My best friend, my partner, the father of my children. When he died 3 years ago, I thought my life was over too. Her voice began to break slightly. But recently, I've met someone, a wonderful man who understands what I've been through, because he's been through it too. And sometimes, when I'm with him, I feel happy, really truly happy. And then I feel guilty for being happy, like I'm betraying William's memory. Steve walked closer to Dorothy, abandoning his host position entirely. Dorothy, can I ask you something? What do you think William would want for you? Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. I know he would want me to be happy. In my head, I know that. William loved me for 40 years. He wouldn't want me to be miserable for the rest of my life. But in my heart, it feels like loving someone new means loving him less. Jennifer, Michael, and David were crying now. The studio audience was completely silent, recognizing that they were witnessing something much more important than entertainment. Can I tell you something, Dorothy? Steve said, and his voice carried a gravity that transcended television. Love doesn't have a limit. Love doesn't run out. The love you had for William doesn't get smaller because you find love again. It doesn't disappear because you choose to be happy. Steve turned to address the entire studio. Ladies and gentlemen, I want everyone in this audience to understand something. This beautiful woman just taught us something about what real love looks like. Real love wants the other person to be happy, even when you can't be the one making them happy anymore. The audience began to rise, not with typical game show enthusiasm, but with something deeper: respect, recognition, understanding. The applause that followed wasn't entertainment applause, it was the sound of people acknowledging someone who had the courage to choose happiness, despite the guilt it brought. But Steve wasn't finished. He walked back to Dorothy, who was now openly emotional, overwhelmed by the unexpected support and understanding. Dorothy, I need you to understand something, Steve said. William didn't just love you for 40 years. He loved you enough to want that love to last forever. And forever love doesn't mean you stop living. It means you live fully, carrying that love with you while making room for new love too. Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his business card, but then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he turned to the audience and made an unprecedented announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, I need everyone in this studio to help me with something. Dorothy has been carrying guilt about being happy, and I think that's something we need to fix right now. Steve addressed Dorothy directly. Dorothy, I want you to look out at this audience. These are 300 people who just heard your story, and not one of them thinks you should feel guilty for finding happiness again. Not one. The audience responded immediately, with voices calling out, "No guilt, and you deserve happiness," and William would be proud. The spontaneous outpouring of support continued for several minutes, with people standing and applauding, and showing their support for Dorothy's right to love again. Jennifer stepped forward from the family area. "Mom," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the studio, "Dad loved you enough to want you to be happy forever, not just while he was here." Michael added, "He would never want you to stop living because he couldn't be here to live with you." David, the youngest, spoke last. "Mom, you taught us that love makes families, and love makes people better. Dad's love made you the amazing woman you are. That doesn't change just because you love someone else too." That's when Steve Harvey did something unprecedented in Family Feud history. He turned to the entire studio and asked a question that had never been asked on television before. "I need everyone in this audience to help me send a message to Dorothy's husband, William," Steve announced. "If you believe that real love wants the other person to be happy, even after death, I want you to stand up and let William know that we're taking care of Dorothy and that it's okay for her to be happy again." The entire studio rose as one. Audience, contestants, production crew, everyone. It wasn't a game show moan. It was a collective act of love and support that transcended television entirely. Steve addressed the cameras directly. "William Chen, if you're watching from wherever love goes when it leaves this world, your wife Dorothy is an amazing woman who loved you completely and is learning to love again. And everyone in this studio wants you to know that we support her happiness, and we believe you would too." Dorothy was sobbing now, not from grief but from relief, from the overwhelming experience of having her guilt acknowledged and gently, lovingly challenged by an entire room full of strangers who understood that love could coexist with new love. The episode aired exactly as it happened, unedited, 6 weeks later. It became one of the highest-rate Family Feud episodes in the show's history. Not because of dramatic television, but because viewers recognized something authentic about the complexity of love and loss and healing. More importantly, it sparked conversations about widow and widower guilt, about the challenges of dating after loss, about the need to give people permission to find happiness after grief. Dorothy Chen returned to Chicago with more than game show memories. She returned with a different understanding of guilt, love, and what it meant to honor someone's memory, while building a new life. The weeks following the taping were transformative for Dorothy. The overwhelming response from viewers was unlike anything she had expected. Letters arrived daily from other widows and widowers, sharing their own stories of guilt and healing, thanking her for giving voice to feelings they had been unable to express. One letter particularly moved her from Patricia, in Tennessee. "Watching you on Family Feud gave me permission to be happy. My husband always said his greatest wish was for me to have a good life. I finally understand that means having a good life even after he's gone." Dorothy began responding to letters, finding purpose in helping others navigate the complex emotions of loving after loss. She discovered her experience wasn't unique. Countless people struggled with the same guilt, the same feeling that happiness was somehow disloyal to their deceased spouses. Her relationship with Robert deepened as they planned their future together. They spent hours talking about their late spouses, sharing memories, creating space in their new relationship for the love they had experienced before. Robert showed Dorothy photos of his late wife Keiko, telling stories about their life together, honoring the woman who had shaped him. The decision to marry came naturally, not as a desperate attempt to recapture what they had lost, but as a mature choice to build something new together. They had both learned that second marriages after loss were different, less about completion and more about companionship, less about passion and more about understanding. 6 months after the Family Feud taping, Dorothy and Robert were married in a small ceremony at the community center, where they had met in grief counseling. The wedding was attended by both families, members of their grief support group, and couples navigating second marriages after loss. Dorothy wore a simple blue dress that William had once told her brought out her eyes. She carried a small photo of William in her bouquet, not as a symbol of divided loyalty, but as recognition that the love that had shaped her was part of who she brought to this new relationship. The ceremony acknowledged both their past loves and their present commitment. The officiant spoke about the courage it takes to love again after loss, about the generosity of spouses who had loved so well that they created people capable of loving again. During their vows, Dorothy and Robert each spoke to their deceased spouses as well as to each other. Dorothy addressed William. "You taught me what love looked like, and because of that, I recognize it again in Robert. Thank you for loving me so well that I know how to love again." The reception was filled with stories from both marriages, photo displays that celebrated both couples' histories, and toasts that honored the journey from loss to love again. Dorothy's son Michael gave a toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes. "Dad would be so happy to see Mom laughing again." "Robert, you're not replacing our father. You're continuing his work of loving our mother." Dorothy continued her work with grief support groups, now speaking specifically to people struggling with guilt about new relationships after loss. She shared her Family Feud experience as a turning point, the moment when she realized that hundreds of strangers could see what she couldn't. Her approach was always gentle, but direct. "Your spouse didn't love you so that you would stop living when they died. They loved you so that you would know how to live fully, how to recognize love, how to give love. That doesn't end because they're gone." Robert joined Dorothy in this work, offering the male perspective on widower guilt. Together they became advocates for the idea that second marriages after loss were not consolation prizes, but different kinds of blessings, relationships built on wisdom earned through loss and gratitude for second chances. They began facilitating workshops for couples who were both widowed, helping them navigate the unique challenges of relationships where both people carried memories of previous marriages. The workshops always began with permission to be happy, permission to love again, permission to build new lives without forgetting. Dorothy's relationship with her children continued to evolve as they watched their mother in her new marriage. They saw her confidence return, her laughter become more frequent, her worry lines soften. Jennifer admitted she had been afraid Dorothy would never be happy again after William's death. "It's not that Robert replaced Dad," Jennifer explained to her own children. "It's that Dad loved Grandma so well that she remembered how to be loved and how to love. Robert is proof that Dad did a good job." The grandchildren adapted quickly to having Robert as an additional grandfather figure. He never tried to take William's place in their memories, but created his own relationship with them, teaching them about photography, helping with school projects. Dorothy still visits William's grave, but now she brings flowers from the garden she and Robert are building together. She talks to William about her new life, about Robert, about their combined families, sharing her happiness without guilt because she finally understands that love multiplies rather than divides. These visits are no longer filled with apologies and requests for permission. Instead, Dorothy shares updates about their children and grandchildren, tells William about places she's traveled with Robert, and expresses gratitude for the 40 years that taught her how to recognize love when she found it again. Robert sometimes joins her for these visits, standing quietly while Dorothy talks to William, showing respect for the relationship that had shaped the woman he loved. He brings his own flowers and speaks briefly to William, thanking him for loving Dorothy so well. The answer Dorothy gave that night never made it onto the board, but it made it into the hearts of thousands of widows and widowers who understood that sometimes the most important permission we need is the permission to be happy again, to love again, to live fully even after loss. Dorothy's story continues to spread through grief support networks, online forums for widowed people, and through the couples she and Robert continue to help in their workshops. She has learned that her experience of guilt was not a personal failing, but a common response to loss, and that healing comes through understanding that love is generous enough to want happiness for the beloved, even when that happiness comes through someone new. The workshops Dorothy and Robert facilitate have helped dozens of couples navigate second marriages after loss. They provide practical guidance about combining households and merging families. But more importantly, they offer emotional support for the complex feelings that arise when building new love on previous love's foundation. One couple they helped, Maria and James, had both lost spouses to cancer. They struggled with children who felt protective of their deceased parents' memories and worried that new step-parents would replace the parents they had lost. Dorothy worked with the children, sharing her family's journey and helping them understand that their parents' new marriage expanded rather than diminished their original families. She showed photos from her blended family celebrations, where William's memory was honored alongside Robert's presence. Being happy again. 3 words that capture the essence of what it means to grieve and heal. Not the betrayal of memory, but the continuation of love in new forms. The understanding that the greatest honor we can give to those we've lost is to live lives so full of love that their love multiplies, rather than ends with death. That's what Dorothy Chen taught America that night. That's what her family taught her. That's what love really means when it's working properly. Not possessive or limiting, but generous enough to want happiness for the beloved, even when that happiness comes through someone new, even when that happiness continues long after death has ended. The physical relationship, but not the eternal love.